Eva Peron, better known as Evita, is one of the most famous women of the 20th century and a near mythical figure in her home country of Argentina. Rising up from humble beginnings, becoming one of the highest paid actresses in Argentina before meeting and marrying Juan Perón, just as he ascended to the pinnacle of power. But few know of her tragic end at the age of 33, where she was lied to about her cancer, never being informed she had it. That her cancer was likely brought on by a disease given to her by her husband, was forced to undergo a lobotomy as her behavior had become erratic, and in the end had her body stolen and taken to Italy, where it was desecrated. This is the story of the brief life and tragic death of Evita. Born Maria Eva Duarte in Los Toldos, Argentina, Evita's childhood was impoverished and unstable. Her father was a wealthy man named Juan Duarte, who had moved to the tiny rural town to manage a ranch owned by his family. Her mother, Juana Ibargoren, took a job as a servant at the ranch and soon became Juan's mistress. At this time in Argentina, it wasn't unusual for wealthy men to have a second family, and for a time, things were stable. Evita's mother, Juana, was only a teenager when she met Evita's father, but she quickly became his mistress and had several children by him, including Eva. She took Duarte's name as if they were married and gained a notorious reputation, as those in her village felt she didn't act with the appropriate level of shame for one in her position. Juan Duarte, for his part, encouraged this. He was, by all accounts, very kind and generous to his second family until he decided to leave. He apparently gave no reasons to Juana and left his second family literally nothing. No money, no means of support, and no legal standing. In the village, Juana was still reviled as a mistress. Rumors spread that she was sleeping with a long list of local men in exchange for food and support. Juan died 5 years later in a car crash, which was when Eva found out that she was illegitimate. Juana and the children went to mourn him and were barred from the funeral by his legitimate wife. As an unmarried woman with illegitimate children, Juana struggled, working tirelessly as a seamstress to support her children. Years later, when Evita was the most famous woman in Argentina, she used her charitable foundation to give away thousands of sewing machines to poor women. The rumors around the town were that Juana would sleep with men for money and favors. Those cruel rumors led the family to cling to each other and become extremely close. Evita's older brother, Juan, became their protector, getting into many fights when people insulted them. Experiencing such negativity and prejudice almost from birth, Evita was understandably an emotional child. She was prone to attacks of rage, and when her grandmother died, she reportedly threw herself on the ground and cried inconsolably. Evita's short life had already been marked by loss, and her childhood as an illegitimate child in a poor home shaped the political views that would have such an impact on the future of her country. As she was not accepted as a legitimate child, she took her mother's name on her birth certificate. Years later, when she was to marry Juan Perón, this became a problem. Argentina was a religious society, and a prominent politician couldn't be with what was called at the time a bastard. In 1945, her sister visited the town clerk and tried to convince him it was in his best interests to alter the records, but he refused. Sometime in the next few months, however, the original birth certificate was destroyed, and a new one that showed her as the legitimate daughter of Juan Duarte was substituted. 26 years after her birth, Evita had finally succeeded in erasing her shameful past. Evita married Juan Perón in 1945 and remained married to him for the final 6 years of her life. Despite being the first family of Argentina during most of this time, Evita and Juan never had children, nor is there any official record of a pregnancy. A woman named Nilda Quartucci claimed to be Evita's illegitimate daughter, born in 1940 when Evita was a struggling actress in Buenos Aires. Her claim has never been proven. Evita expressed a desire for children when she married Perón, but may have suffered a miscarriage as a result of her uterine problems which developed into terminal cervical cancer just a few years later. As a beautiful woman in 1940s who seemed to rise up out of nowhere to become one of the most famous and influential people in the country, if not the world, it would be surprising if Evita didn't have enemies. And those enemies tried their best to spread malicious rumors about her, one of which was particularly hurtful, that she'd been a sex worker in Buenos Aires prior to meeting Juan Perón. In the Argentina of that time, it was still common to believe sex workers were manipulative women with secret powers of influence. As Evita gained prominence and enemies, it was easy to combine her obscure past with her sudden relationship with Juan and imply that she'd seduced him using her professional sexuality. This idea gained so much credence that even Jorge Luis Borges, a respected literary figure in Argentina, accepted that Evita had been a common prostitute before marrying Juan Perón. This was especially painful because Evita's mother and grandmother were both accused of sleeping with others for money when she was a child, solely because her mother was a fallen woman who'd had children outside of wedlock. Another rumor that plagues her to this day is that Evita was a Nazi sympathizer who profited from the Holocaust, accepting gifts of treasure stolen from Jewish people in the concentration camps. Argentina became a safe haven for Nazi war criminals in the aftermath of World War II. As author John Barnes notes, Argentina was in a powerful economic position because of the war-torn world's need for food, and Juan Perón was able to ignore even the United States when they demanded that war criminals be extradited. Argentina hoped Nazi scientists and technicians could contribute to the Argentinian economy. But as the Washington Post reports, quoting historian Marisa Navarro, there's no evidence that Evita was directly involved with the policy that welcomed Nazis, such as Adolf Eichmann, or that she received any treasures. The bottom line is that while there's little doubt that Juan Perón was a Nazi sympathizer, there's little evidence that Evita shared his feelings. The first sign that Evita was ill came in early 1950, when she fainted while giving a speech. She was rushed to the hospital, and it was announced that her appendix had been removed and that she was recovering. In truth, she had developed cervical cancer at the age of 30. But Evita was not informed of the diagnosis and continued to work a punishing schedule that left her visibly thin and exhausted. While Evita was kept ignorant of her disease, Juan Perón and his government took steps in secret to try and treat her without revealing her cancer. When her pain and suffering became agonizing and doctors feared she'd soon be too weak for surgery, they tried to convince her to have a hysterectomy, but she refused, believing her political enemies simply wanted to remove her from public life. When Evita was finally convinced that the operation was necessary, Dr. George T. Pack, one of the leading oncologists at the time, was secretly flown in to perform the procedure. Evita never met Dr. Pack and did not even know he performed the surgery. Evita's last public appearance was at her husband's second inauguration ceremony, during which she rode next to him in a car, waving at the adoring crowds. She was so weak and in so much pain that she had to wear a special brace under her clothes to remain upright. Evita's painful early death from cervical cancer was tragic. At the height of her power, influence, and fame, she was felled by a terrible disease, one which might have been treatable even in 1952. But not only was she never informed that she had cancer, but she didn't receive treatment until it was far too late. In addition, her cancer was likely caused by a venereal disease. 99% of cervical cancers are caused by human papillomavirus, HPV. Many people become infected with HPV over their lifetimes, but most fight it off without suffering any ill effects. Some men can pass it on to their partners, however, where it can cause cervical cancer. Juan Perón's first wife, Aurelia Tizón, also died at a very young age of cervical cancer, and her death was eerily similar to Evita's, marked by bleeding, pain, and terrible suffering. This makes it likely that Perón was an unwitting carrier of HPV and infected both of his wives, dooming them to a painful death. One of the most horrifying details of Evita's last days was secret until fairly recently. The BBC reported in 2015 that examinations of her remains had led medical researchers to believe she underwent a prefrontal lobotomy shortly before her death. Lobotomies were once seen as an effective remedy for many ailments, including chronic pain and emotional distress. Evita's doctors thought the brain surgery would reduce her suffering, or at least make it a little more bearable. But the physician who conducted the research believes the procedure had a more nefarious goal: to control her increasingly irrational behavior during a hard-fought presidential campaign. As the BBC notes, in her final months, Evita became increasingly violent in her speeches and had reportedly ordered weapons, which she intended to hand out to her supporters. This rhetoric and the arming of a private army could have led Argentina to a bitter civil war, and it's theorized that Evita's husband, President Juan Perón, might have ordered the lobotomy in order to control her better during the campaign. When Evita died in 1952, she was an immensely important political figure in Argentina. While many in the rich upper classes and the military despised her and her husband, President Juan Perón, she was almost a saintly religious figure to the poor and the working class. Which is why, when Juan Perón was overthrown in a violent coup in 1955, military officers took possession of her body and hid it away. They feared her corpse would be a focal point for the opposition, so they sought to remove this powerful symbol of what was known as Peronism. But the military government had a problem. No matter where they hid Evita's body, her supporters would find it and mark the site with flowers and other tributes. The military moved the body several times, but it kept happening. Eventually, they had Evita's remains shipped to Italy, where they were buried under a false name. Even then, trouble followed. In 1970, Peronist supporters kidnapped and assassinated former President General Pedro Aramburu because he'd overseen the theft of Evita's body. Evita remained in Italy until 1971, when Peronism was legalized and she was returned to her husband. A few years after Perón's triumphant return to power in Argentina and his sudden death, Evita was finally returned to her home. Her remains were finally laid to rest in Buenos Aires in 1976, 21 years after they were stolen. When she was alive and one of the most powerful people in Argentina, she was subjected to many attacks on her morals and character, most commonly that she had been a sex worker before marrying Juan Perón. Her politics were controversial and became even more so during the years when Argentina was racked by revolution and military dictatorship. Her life was a rags-to-riches story, through which some saw how their own lives could be transformed. Others viewed her as an opportunist who had seduced a powerful man. Her death at a young age was tragic and preventable, and her legacy is long debated, but the effect she had on the people during and after her life will never be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed our look at the death of Evita. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you like content like this, it really helps keep the channel alive. And as always, thanks for watching.